In the pantheon of successful and beloved video games, it can be really easy to point to units sold as a measurement of influence. After all, if a game made it into millions and millions of hands, it must have more overall value than the competition. And if I'm being fair, there can be some truth in that idea. But I think often you need to look beyond raw profits to find success in this industry. Sometimes a title's going to have more of an impact than earning potential. Sometimes a game attaches itself to a loyal fan base and is able to influence the way everything that comes after it is measured. And if you're purposefully watching this video, I would say there's a good chance you'll agree that Silent Hill 2 is very much a part of that latter category. It's a project that's adhered itself to the gaming zeitgeist in a way I don't think you can really replicate, telling a story that strikes right at the core of the more negative aspects of the human experience in a way that manages to walk a razor-thin line on the intersection of entertainment, emotional value, and self-reflection. Which is precisely why I had absolutely no faith in its remake when it was announced in October of 2022. And I really don't think you could blame me. I mean, it's a title funded by a company that has historically not been very kind to the Silent Hill fanbase, being worked on by a development studio that could probably be best described as established but unproven in terms of AAA video game production. And weighing even heavier on this teeter-tottering skyscraper of potential failure is the fact that replicating Silent Hill 2's wildly emotional storytelling is something that's been both unsuccessfully attempted and misunderstood more times than I can count. Well, as is tradition here on this channel, I am incredibly late to the party, but the goal of today's video is to answer one question in two different ways. Is Silent Hill 2 Remake a good video game? And more importantly, does it live up to the expectations carried by its name? What's up, guys? I'm Jared from Avalanche Reviews, welcoming you all back to the Silent Hill Retrospective.
Excuse me.
I'm sorry. I was just...
Hey, it's okay. I didn't mean to scare you.
Before we fully jump into the Silent Hill 2 Remake, there's a few things we're going to have to lay out, and I think it's important to start off with why this thing was faced with more hesitancy than outright excitement. Because at a surface-level glance, this entire scenario could be easily confused for an unpleasable fanbase gatekeeping their favorite game, and to be totally fair to anyone who's making that assumption, it's not like there isn't a reason to feel that way. I mean, Silent Hill 2 has sort of taken on an Earthbound-esque position in the horror scene, and what I mean by that is that there are a lot of people that are more interested in what the game says about them and their deep taste in media than they are in actually playing it. To put it another way, I would bet a large sum of money on there being more YouTube video essays on the game than people who have actually beaten it. So the initial apprehension was pretty easy to label as Silent Hill fans being expectedly negative. In reality though, we've got a pretty good reason to be distrustful, and that reason's full name is Konami.
If you don't want me around anymore, you can just say it.
Now, I'm not sure how many people know this, but the Big K doesn't make a majority of its money through traditional video game sales. Here in Japan, they're actually one of the biggest companies involved in the fitness industry, owning tons of gyms across the country, including the one that I work out at every day. And if you roll that in with the revenue they take from gambling hardware, you've got a rough 60% of their income accounted for. Now, I bring this up because there was a time when the gaming end of the business started to dip financially, prompting the company to defocus game development and reorient themselves towards their more profitable departments, which meant all but the most reliable franchises were essentially left to rot on the vine. After a while, this led to Konami outsourcing development for some of their most beloved IPs to outside studios, and this ultimately meant lending the Silent Hill name to literally anyone who put in a bid for it. And this was the period that gave us Silent Hill Origins, Shattered Memories, Homecoming, Book of Memories, and Downpour. Titles that differed pretty wildly in quality, but all shared the same main issue. These were all entries in a franchise that were created by people who either horribly misunderstood the series or were convinced that the only worthwhile entry it ever saw was Part 2. And among every single one of these post-Team Silent SH games, there's a shared attempt at recreating the fiercely dedicated fan reaction to Silent Hill 2 in the form of what I would call a thinly veiled effort at outright retelling its major story beats. I mean, if you think you can point to a single one of them and tell me that it's not about a person forcing themselves to forget a major trauma that they eventually remember through the process of fighting their own inner demons, well, you're about as delusional as one of their main characters. And while we could certainly disagree on the varying levels of quality across these titles, I think we can admit that none of them succeeded in recreating the fan hype of their source material. So when Konami announced that an as-yet-to-be-proven development studio would be remaking SH2, the news was met with a fairly earned amount of animosity, and I can admit that a healthy amount of that aggressive skepticism was coming directly from me. After all, as a guy who's been with the series since the initial launch of its first entry, I've lived long enough to see its downward slope and all the ways Konami attempted to use it as a low-investment, low-risk money-making endeavor. And believe me, I'm more than aware that I'm currently spending more time explaining the reasons behind the question hanging in the air than actually answering it. And that question is, after the gaming public finally got its hands on the Silent Hill 2 remake, was all the apprehension, skepticism, and distrust warranted? Well, let's talk about that. Alright, so after doing some thinking, I've decided it's not exactly necessary to relitigate Silent Hill 2's story here. If that's something you are interested in, I have a video that goes pretty in-depth on the original SH2 that should be showing up in the corner now. But for the time being, I don't think a full recap of that narrative is essential for me to say this. The Silent Hill 2 remake is, and I can't believe this is about to come out of my mouth, actually incredibly faithful to its progenitor's story. Now, before you flood me with wild reactions to this news, I'm talking more about the overall flow and events of the original tale. If I'm going to be fair, there are several scenes present in OG SH2 that aren't here in the remake, which you could take as a massive departure. But personally, I would argue that both stories have essentially the same beginning, middle, and end. It nails all the major events and very accurately recreates the valuable story interactions from the OG release to what I would call a genuinely praiseworthy degree. And to explain my surprise here, not only is this a newly developed SH title, which historically has meant a game made by people who don't really understand Silent Hill and just want to introduce their own interpretation of it, but the little bit of pre-release media and interviews that I remember seeing about this project seemed to veer pretty hard in the direction of there are going to be changes, potentially significant ones. But after I finally beat the game, I was kind of floored with how respectful they were with faithfully recreating, let's say 99.9% of what was in the original. Now, for those of you that think that a remake necessarily has to change that original vision, this may not be the best news, but I would argue that Silent Hill 2 is a bit of a unique scenario in that sense. I mean, not only is it a widely beloved video game, but its story goes a bit beyond just entertainment. A lot of people have attached a ton of genuine emotional value to these events, and I think tinkering with that formula a little too much could have a very noticeable and negative effect on that. Which is precisely why I'm so excited to say that Bloober team has shown a remarkable level of care with and awareness of this story's original intent. So if you haven't played this remake yet, and the reason is that you understandably don't want to see one of your favorite psychological deep dives ruined by a developer who thinks they could do a better job telling it than the people who originally created it, let me go ahead and put those worries to bed right now. I do have to say once again though, this only goes for the general story beats. The way that this story is being delivered has most certainly changed, and this is where we're going to get into some very, very dicey territory.
Sorry. Anyway, I'm glad you're alive.
Anyway!
If you're not already aware of this, Silent Hill 2's original voice cast has become a bit of a polarizing subject among fans of the series and newcomers alike. Meaning there's essentially two camps here. You're either on team SH2's voice work was intentionally crafted to achieve a very specific feel and is masterfully executed in that sense, or you feel like its admittedly stilted delivery and overall, let's say, amateur nature is one aspect of the game that hasn't aged very well over the years. And you know, to be honest, I tend to line up more in the middle. For example, when the HD collection of Silent Hills 2 and 3 was released, I was furious that new voice lines were recorded. mostly because these were the original games, showing the original scenes I was familiar with, but starring all new voices that, in my opinion, missed the mark on recreating the performances they were meant to replicate. And I do agree that the original actors in SH2 deliver a very David Lynchian kind of performance, giving off very deliberate feelings of things being just a bit off. That being said, playing the original to completion maybe 4 or 5 times in the course of comparing all of its ports a while back, it is kind of hard to escape the idea that some of the dialogue would have sounded more convincing or natural if it hadn't have been written by a few Japanese people who may not have had the most organic grip on the English language. And I'm about to open myself up to an entire torrent of fan backlash by saying, alright, here we go. I do feel like overall, this new cast of voice actors in the remake deliver much more convincing and emotionally impactful performances than what you would find in the PS2 original release. No, I get it, I know. I deserve this. I'm a monster. Normally, I feel like this wouldn't be such a controversial take. I mean, the idea that video game voice acting has seen a massive positive trend towards more talented performances on average is just flat out objectively true and something most people would agree with. I can, however, admit that SH2 is a special case. Those original voice actors have a very interesting effect on the game's story. They bring an originality and vibe to it that I would argue couldn't have been recreated no matter how hard anyone tried. I mean, by hiring more talented performers, you almost necessarily lose out on the feel that the originals brought to the table. So maybe my willing acceptance of these new VAs comes from me making peace with this fact. I was fully aware that there was going to be no way to accurately portray Guy Seehey's James Sunderland without having the man himself reprise that role. So I reserved myself to the idea that things were going to be noticeably different, and I guess I just hoped that there would be enough skill on display with the new voices to make up the difference. And I'll stand firmly on the idea that there is. I really feel like the voice acting in this remake is approaching The Last of Us in terms of quality and organically talented execution. But like I said before, things are different here. If we stack them up side by side, these new iterations of SH2's cast tend to take on roughly similar personalities, but through alterations in writing and delivery, they can achieve very different end results. For example, when meeting Angela for the first time in the graveyard, when James doesn't heed her warnings about Silent Hill being potentially dangerous, she almost lashes out with anger that his actions are some kind of sign that she could be lying.
I'll be careful.
I'm not lying.
And in the remake, she's more nervously blurting this line out, not because she's angry that James would be so flippant about her warning, but more that she recognizes how odd that might sound and she wants to make sure he doesn't think she's crazy.
I'll be careful.
I'm not lying.
Similarly, James's reaction remains largely the same in terms of the words that he uses, but the delivery here in the remake seems to say a little more about him as a character. In the original, he's already dead set on heading into town, and his response to Angela feels like a conclusion he's long since reached in his own head.
No, I believe you. It's just, I guess I really don't care if it's dangerous or not.
Now over on the remake, he seems to be coming to this realization almost mid-sentence. Kind of like these are all thoughts that he's toyed with, but the process of speaking them into reality has made him finally accept their existence.
No, I believe you. It's just... I guess I don't really care if it's dangerous or not.
If we move on to the first interaction with Maria, her questions take on an almost intentionally provocative tone in the original, sort of like she's leading James to some kind of conclusion, asking questions that she already knows the answer to.
Do I look like your girlfriend?
But over on the remake, she's less blatantly adversarial and a little more mysterious.
Do I look like your girlfriend?
The implication that she might know more than she's letting on is still hanging in the air in my opinion, but now she seems genuinely more curious and not like she's asking these questions to provoke a specific response. You can find similar differences in delivery all over the remake, and I would say more than half of the original's conversations tend to take on notably different emotional tones because of this, despite, like I said earlier, achieving roughly the same resulting meaning. But while listening to those comparisons, you might have noticed something that hit me across the face almost immediately. Silent Hill 2 Remake's script is, surprisingly, a near one-to-one analog with the original. There have been a few changes made to some interactions, and like I mentioned before, some have been cut, but for the most part, an SH2 superfan could play this game and mount a lot of these sequences right along with the new actors. And I say that because that's exactly what I did. As I would hear a character start to shift into a line that I knew by heart, I would mock perform it, and to my surprise, they would match my delivery almost word for word.
None of your business. You didn't love Mary anyway.
I'm not like you.
Are you afraid?
I didn't do anything. He was like that when I got here.
It seems to me that for the most part, the idea going into this game was to hit the exact same high notes as the original script while shifting around some of the words leading up to those well-known quotes and phrases. What I really liked about this is how it doesn't come off as fan service, but instead a genuine effort to stay faithful to the game that they're remaking, and I can assure you it goes a very long way in helping you accept these new voices as the characters you already know and love. I assume you're going to notice this as a continuing trend as we get further into this video, but Silent Hill 2 Remake is about as accurate to the original as it is different. As you play, it can be really hard to brush off the feeling that you've done all this before, but with the slight changes to conversations and where you encounter them, it's still able to surprise you. You know, this is going to sound a little lame, but I feel like this remake does a great job of giving me a second chance to play Silent Hill 2 for the first time. It was both familiar and offered enough of a new experience that I could trick myself into thinking the story could potentially end up anywhere, despite knowing exactly where it was going. Now, I'll go ahead and let you know that I'm already well aware that some of you are going to take issue with my affinity towards these new takes on SH2's roster, and I genuinely do get it.
It does feel familiar somehow. Like a bad memory.
Silent Hill 2, like I've already said and will say infinity more times, is a game that people have really taken to heart. It's a story that strikes at a lot of very real issues that real-life people tend to wrestle with, and is one of the first games that comes to my mind to deal with such mature subject matter so well, it's naturally going to have made a very real impact on people in its original form. And I think in that way, most of us already knew that there was going to be a portion of the fan base that would have never accepted this remake no matter how well it was handled. And with all due respect, if that does happen to describe you, what I've been saying here never really stood a chance at changing your mind on that anyways. Trust me, if these guys ever get their hands on the rights to remake the third game in the series, I'm gonna know exactly how you feel. But if you find yourself on the fence, wondering if it's even possible to recreate such a landmark narrative in gaming, in my opinion, Bloober team got about as close to that as anyone could have ever hoped. It's actually an interesting sort of middle ground, because Silent Hill 2 Remake's story feels to me like the product of a team that had a genuine and honest reverence for Konami's original creation, but that being said, this was not a group of people that saw Team Silent as some kind of godlike tribunal who weren't physically able to do wrong. In playing this remake, you are definitely going to see a modicum of interpretation, alteration, and, dare I say it, improvement in terms of some of the dialogue and tone. But the good news is, all of these new roads still lead right back to that same foggy town that we all remember, and I would say that's worth celebrating.
Sure.
Not quite the ringing endorsement, but hey, I'll take it.
Well, after that story section, I think we basically ensured no more Silent Hill fans are watching by this point, so what do you guys say we move forward and discuss what you can expect from this game in terms of how it plays? For those of you that don't know, Silent Hill 2, aside from having a very meaningful and frankly ahead of its time story, was also a near-perfect continuation of Keiichiro Toyama's imaginative take on survival horror that he called psychological horror. They may have gotten rid of the inventory management and limited resources of Capcom's zombie-based Panic Attack masquerading as a video game, but Team Silent kept in a lot of what made those titles so tense and challenging. And I think it's fitting Resident Evil would come up here because just like how Silent Hill wouldn't have existed without Resident Evil, Silent Hill 2 Remake I think wouldn't have existed without Resident Evil 2 Remake. When Capcom brought their second RE game to the modern market, you could find more than a few complaints levied at the release, but I think most would agree it was a very amicable middle ground between that classic survival horror era of gameplay and the more modern friendly elements that would be introduced later in the series. I mean, sure, changes were certainly made to the perspective, and shooting gave the player a little more agency over the combat, but underneath the surface inspired by RE4, the heart of a 90s survival horror title beat. And you know, besides that, it was a pretty big financial achievement as well. I think it stood as an example to the rest of the industry. It let them know that not only could portions of these old titles still survive in a modern market, but for those who were sitting on retro horror IPs, it meant a potential source of untapped revenue. And I took you down that digression because I think SH2R feels a lot like RE2R, and I don't just mean as a modern horror remake that's been turned into an over-the-shoulder shooter. Although, you know, that as well. Silent Hill 2, despite having what I would call pretty radical changes to its overall original gameplay, feels incredibly true to the spirit of that original. So let's unpack that by breaking things down into what I would call its two main components. Over on one side, we've got the general survival horror exploration, and on the other, we've got the combat. And since in my opinion it's the least recognizable element, we should probably start off with the latter. I'll admit combat in the original Silent Hill 2 was relatively simple. It took a lot from genre doctrine by taking on the hold a shoulder button and hit an action button to execute attacks type of gameplay popularized by Resident Evil, but added the ability to move while readying strikes. And that may seem like a really small element nowadays, but back when Silent Hill was launched, that added mobility made combat a much more viable option than it ever had been in any RE title. And you know, since we're on the subject, I'll come out and say this now. I am not one of those people who thinks this style of mechanics has aged poorly. I mean, if you ask me, the combat in Silent Hill 2's original release feels just as good and satisfying as it did when I first played it. And I think I might know why some would disagree. It seems like within the last 10 to 15 years, the main focus in gaming has been in delivering high-speed control over your character's most minute actions. But sitting in direct defiance of that, the original survival horror style of combat has never really been based on the idea of perfectly timing and executing button presses. Instead, it relied on a more thought-based approach. Players needed to think a bit before relegating themselves to taking an enemy out. They needed to take into account how many resources they had on them and whether or not fighting was truly the only viable option. Hell, in my opinion, these games made spacing more important than the mechanical act of actually attacking. Even though you might want to slam on the action button and keep swinging until the enemy dies, it's often more advantageous to take a few hits, then back up and wait for a large enough opening to get a few more in. And if you really wanted to, you might be able to argue that there's at least some portion of that approach still living inside this remake, but if you've been looking at the video so far, you could probably tell things have definitely changed. This remake's new third-person over-the-shoulder combat is a pretty wild departure from the source material, and just for reference, here's your average encounter in Silent Hill 2. And here's what you can expect in its remake. So it basically works like this. You hit the right trigger or left click on your mouse to execute a melee attack and hold down the left trigger or right mouse button to aim a gun. Melee attacks have a tendency to soft lock onto a target, which will have James sort of magnetizing himself to the nearest enemy when an attack is active. Now, truth be told, I never really got a great feel for how far away I could be to trigger this, which explains why even towards the end of the game, I was still whiffing attacks when enemies were stun locked. Just like you're used to with any other Silent Hill game, enemies here need to be further smashed into pace to ensure they won't get back up again, and you know, I'd be lying if I said this wasn't the most satisfying that process has ever felt in the series. I really can't tell you how many times I 100% knew a bad guy was down but kept stomping him out anyways, just for having the audacity of actually getting a hit off on me. As far as firearms go, we've actually got some interesting stuff to talk about. Just like in real life, guns here in Silent Hill are a great way to avoid a game over screen or, conversations, but I get the feeling the intent was for you to use them alongside your melee weapons instead of guns acting as a replacement for metal pipes. I mean, you can just empty rounds into a bad guy to down them, but the monsters that plague James have received a bit of a speed boost, and they aren't afraid to rush you at a moment's notice to get in close. And when a monster's right on top of you, it can be hard to stay on target, even if you're aiming at center mass. On top of that, the jerky nature of how they move does a really great job of naturally ensuring you aren't always guaranteed a hit even when they are far away. So for most, the best strategy is going to be to aim at a monster's leg for a few shots, which will bring them to their knees, where you can then deliver a massive melee strike that'll put them on the ground and prepare them to be tenderized. I found this to be a pretty cool method of ensuring that ammo conservation stays an effective strategy, even in a game whose perspective seems a little more tailor-made for shooting than fisticuffs. In any of the fights where I did feel overwhelmed enough to warrant pulling a firearm out, I found that I still had to rely on my melee weapons, which made for a more dynamic feeling encounter than just blasting away till everything stops moving. And like I already said, the speed of the monsters here makes guns less of a natural go-to and more of a situational option. Now you guys may have already noticed this, but we've got another new inclusion here in the form of a dodge button. At any point in a fight, James can slide himself out of the way of an incoming attack, and this is something you're going to need to take constant advantage of because the nightmare creatures of James's inner psyche have all been given way more robust movesets than they ever had in the original. Each monster still has what you could probably call their signature attacks, like the lying figure's acid spit or the mannequin's little leg/arm pummel. But they've also been given variants of those moves. Everything's been given a few different close quarters maneuvers and some more long range options on top of all new grab attacks that you'll have to mash your way out of. And with all the potential new sources of damage to James, he's been given something I really didn't like at first. This new dodge move is something that, mechanically speaking, I have zero issues with. In fact, it works pretty well. It's quick as hell, but requires a few frames of recovery to avoid spamming it, and once you figure out that you stay essentially invincible to everything except for grab moves during the entire animation, it can make combat pretty damn dynamic. So what's the issue then? Well, remember how I said that fighting in the original seemed like a really cool safe haven from input-heavy and precision-driven combat systems? Well, this seems to be moving in the opposite direction. So I end up stuck in this kind of weird place where I can 100% see this mechanic for how much value it adds to the gameplay in terms of modern video game combat, but a part of me still feels like it doesn't quite belong. Go ahead, call me biased because, well, I am, but it feels to me more like Silent Hill Homecoming than it does Silent Hill 2. That being said, again, it is perfectly functional and, I'll admit, really damn fun. So as we continue forward, just know that I'm going to be morally conflicted by any of the praise that I give it. I will admit though, at first this dodge system felt kind of awkward to me. Because it was so forgiving, it almost lulled me into a false sense of security that had me paying less attention to what the enemy was up to, and that's when I would usually get my ass kicked. Eventually though, I learned to keep a careful eye on each monster I came up against, and more importantly, I started to learn their individual patterns. Thanks to the larger moveset that I mentioned before, each bad guy you square up with can choose from a pretty varied pool of moves in a fight, and getting a good idea of what each one of those attacks looks like before they come out can be the razor-thin line between taking several hits and breezing through a fight untouched. As the game goes on and new foes are introduced, you'll encounter more intricate attack patterns and honest-to-God combos that can actually test your reaction time until it becomes muscle memory. I'd say personally though, I had the most fun fighting mannequins. These things for some reason just had the right flow, and eventually I get really good at reading their wind-ups and reacting perfectly to their dodges and follow-up attacks. And as a bit of a side note, I would say these guys also went the furthest in making the game actually scary. I mean, your first fight with one goes off without a hitch, but as you start to encounter them more, you'll notice their AI's been tweaked in a really interesting way. Sometimes when you run into a room, these things will actually scurry away from you, running to go hide in some other spot. And if you're like me, you're definitely going to follow them, thinking you're about to get the jump on their four-legged asses until you notice that they've led you right into a trap where one of their friends was hiding too. And you know, when I say hiding, I more mean hiding in plain sight. Sometimes these things will just stand in a corner with no cover. It can be kind of comical until it works on you. I really can't count the number of times that I completely missed one being in the room with me because they were standing there completely still and not making any noises. And I found it to be really cool that they'll just jump out of this hiding state if you spend too much time looking at them. Kind of like they're good enough predators to know when they've been found out. Later on in the game, you'll come up against the bubblehead nurses, which I would argue actually pose the largest threat, mostly because a lot of their attacks have the same magnetic lock-on as yours do, so good dodging and pattern recognition is a must. I'd say that overall, while it did take me a relatively long time to start getting proficient with the game's combat, I did eventually move from just accepting its existence to having a lot of fun with it. And even when I did start to get so good with my dodges that one-on-one fights were no longer challenging, the game would throw several different types of enemies at me in a single encounter, which would force me to consider target priority and spacing much more than I had before. That being said, I think those exact scenarios are probably where the melee combat specifically starts showing a lot of its cracks. Thanks to a combination of the game's soft lock-on and a camera that zooms way too far in during fights and swoops around to a pretty nauseating degree, it can be very easy to come out of an attack sort of disoriented or, at the very least, having lost sight of the other monsters surrounding you. It's sort of like the recent Callisto Protocol in the sense that the combat system seems to have been optimized for individual combatants, and anything outside of that turns into a game of,
"Which one of y'all kicked me?"
On top of that, these weird-looking humanoid manifestations can follow you from room to room now, so avoiding combat is a little harder than it used to be. I did try turning my flashlight off and sneaking past a few enemies, but they aggroed right to me, so I don't think that works. Now, I'm going to be honest and say that everything I just mentioned doesn't come anywhere near being game-breaking for me, because I did eventually get the combat down to a science, but more than that, in a potential move to mirror the original's experience, Remake basically throws healing items and ammo at you. As I was nearing the end of the game on normal combat difficulty, I was rocking a good 40 or 50 health drinks, 15 syringes, and nearly 200 rounds of ammo for my pistol. So if a rock-solid challenge is what you're after, I'd say consider hard mode. And speaking of which, Silent Hill 2 Remake does a pretty commendable job at shaking up the original's admittedly simplistic boss fights with new phases and strategies. The only issue being that the new dodge move makes these encounters almost laughably easy. Like I said before, I played on normal combat difficulty, and I actually died on the first Pyramid Head fight. But in dying, I learned that he cooks his attacks to try to bait out a dodge from the player, which should make him open for damage during the recovery frames. After I figured that out, I restarted the fight, and I beat him without taking a single hit of damage. And as it turns out, this is essentially the trick to the rest of the boss fights in the game. Don't dodge when their wind-up starts, but a few frames later and you're effectively invincible, which certainly has a negative effect on the game's challenge. I'll admit I did take a bunch of damage from Eddie, but by the time that fight happened, I had hoarded so many consumables that it really didn't matter. As long as I still had the physical ability to press the use item hotkey, I couldn't be killed. If I had to summarize my thoughts on this new combat system, I would say it works most of the time, and once you figure it out, it can be really fun. On the negative end of things, the camera's proximity in fights will definitely cause you some undeserved damage, and it does make boss encounters boringly easy, but in my opinion, the pros more than outweigh the cons. And again, I really want to point out that this is coming from somebody who has always enjoyed the combat in the original Silent Hill 2. I can assure you I'm not one of those guys who thinks there's no way traditional survival horror combat could work today. I mean, take a look at my backlog. Signalis, Crow Country, Tormented Souls, Conscript, Alyssa, Hollow Body. All of them are very fun experiences that put old school survival horror combat mechanics to masterful use. But if we are going to be transplanting stuff into a great game like Silent Hill 2, I guess it's good that it's pretty well polished and works most of the time. And listen, no one loves holding down a trigger and pressing an action button more than I do, but the vast majority of an SH2 playthrough isn't actually going to contain any combat at all. Because Silent Hill as a series may have deviated from its inspiration Resident Evil in a lot of ways, but one area where it stayed the most true was its exploration. True to their survival horror roots, the only way to make any progress in these games is to map out your surroundings, hunt for keys, and solve puzzles that will collectively unlock even more of the floor plan to examine. And at the risk of losing even more of my SH credentials, I think this may be another area where the remake surpasses the original. I deserve this, I fully understand. You're in the right here. The first thing that struck me as I got past the 4-hour mark of the game was how much it felt like Capcom's remake of RE1. Not only was Bloober team playing with the expectations of series vets who knew the original in and out, but they also added what I would call really effective additions to that classic foundation. I do have to say though, there have been some, let's say, non-additive changes as well. Some scenes are no longer in the game, whole puzzles have been removed, and a few key items are no longer a part of progression. Now, in my opinion, there were enough original concepts inserted that most things that are missing feel like they've been effectively replaced by something else, but I can more than understand this being some pretty hard news to take. Like the aforementioned RE1R, the floor plan in most areas remains relatively unchanged in the broad strokes. If there's a room in the original, you stand a better than good chance of getting to visit that same room here in the remake, but the glue connecting all those rooms together seems to be where the team really focused their efforts. My favorite new implementation is how parts of each area now snakes back in on itself in a way that makes backtracking more convenient but doesn't outright negate your need to do it. And it really works well in my opinion. This comes in the form of latch doors, holes in walls, and traversable objects that'll reconnect you to a central area, which makes it much easier to get back on track in a different direction. A lot of the key items that you'll come across have rooms nearby that'll dump you back out to a path leading at least somewhere near where you might want to use it. Something that seems very small on the surface but makes for far less uneventful backtracking. On that note, monsters do get back up after you've downed them sometimes, which might sound annoying, but I found this happens at a wildly random kind of rate and wasn't so common that it was overwhelming. It just happened frequently enough that I stayed a little more on edge, or better yet engaged, when traversing a path that I had already cleared out. Overall, I would say at the very least the act of exploring Silent Hill and simultaneously James Sunderland's Inner Torment feels about on par with the original SH2, if not a little better in some areas. There is a bit of an issue though. This game is long. I mean, 15 to 20 hours might not sound like too much of an investment, but it's certainly orders of magnitude longer than the original, and even more importantly, I think spending that much time stuck inside Silent Hill's special brand of tense atmosphere can be especially rough. I'm being dead serious when I say that there was a few times where I would have to quit out of the game and just relax for a bit. I mean, 4 or 5 straight hours of checking every single corner for a mannequin can take its toll on you. On top of that, I'd say there's definitely an argument to be made for tightening up its pacing a bit. Now personally, I didn't find any one part of the game to be especially or egregiously boring, but this does seem to be a pretty common complaint. And to be fair to the remake, even when playing the OG release of 2, I would often find myself ready for it to be over by the time I got to Lakeview, and at least a part of me found this to be the case here as well. Now on the other side of that, the game spends so much time subverting your expectations that it's not really hard to stay engaged with it, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't let out a bit of a sigh of relief by the time I finally beat it. I'd say one big change to the gameplay that I'm essentially neutral on is the breakable glass. Just about every molecule of translucent material in Silent Hill can be smashed now, and sometimes this will open up a new path or net you an item.
Again.
To me, it's one of those things that's just kind of there. I mean, I guess it's nice, but if it wasn't a mechanic in the game, I definitely wouldn't be wishing that it was. But since I did mention the game's usables, I've got to say that I really enjoyed how items, which would normally be sitting out in the open, now have to be found in drawers, cabinets, or people's cars. I mean, admittedly, it's not the biggest change in the world, but just a bit of effort towards taking away some of that video gaminess in a property like this one is always appreciated. Now, since we're talking Silent Hill, we aren't necessarily talking puzzles, and I'll say this is one area that's pretty easy to call a win. I do have to warn you though, a lot of things have changed in this department. There are the expected returning hits and a few brand new ones, but surprisingly there were a good number of original puzzles that just didn't make the cut, which was kind of weird to see since the runtime was so much longer than the original SH2. You would kind of figure that there would have been more than enough room for both new and old. I guess it's up to you to determine how that's going to affect your playthrough, but I found that solving the puzzles that are here stays pretty damn sturdy on the boundary between being challenging enough to satisfy, but not so hard that the game comes to a crashing halt when you come across one. It appears to me that the more notoriously tough ones have been made a little less punishing, and the ones that most people would breeze through have seen a slight boost in difficulty. Honestly, they're really fun. Now, I'm not necessarily a puzzle game aficionado, but getting to figure out relatively intuitive mental hurdles is a big part of what makes this genre so damn enthralling, and it's really nice to see a game paying tribute to that. However, if you do tend to enjoy Silent Hill's specific style of puzzle reasoning, I would say maybe play on the hard puzzle difficulty, because I found this to be just challenging enough, and I'm kind of an idiot, so you do that math. Now, on the negative side of things, I think the inventory screen looks kind of unfinished and is organized really sloppily to me. But on the plus side, you almost never need to actually use it since so many functions, holy shit. This is an R-rated video. Since so many functions have been given hotkeys. Essentially, you're just going to have to use it to combine key items, which isn't all that common, and reread files that you've come across. It is still kind of weird that it's so ass though. Oh, and also, I had a problem picking stuff up. Like a lot. It felt like there was an invisible in-game reticle that I needed to line up with interactables to be able to interact with them, and often it took me a really long time to do that. I went and checked in the options, and I found that there was indeed a toggle for a persistent cursor, so I guess you could turn that on if you experience this problem, but it's a little weird that the game seems to have been made with that in mind, but by default they turned it off. And you know, using that as a springboard, let's end on a positive note. I really have to give it up to Bloober team for the absolute wealth of options you get in customizing your experience here. I assume you guys have figured out by now that I'm the kind of guy who wants immersion over mechanical functionality, but when a game gives me this many potential choices to make, I don't necessarily need to choose one over the other. If you want, you can completely get rid of your ammo counter, make it dynamically disappear, or have it stay visible all the time. Don't like the red vignette that tells you James is about to die? Just turn it off. And you don't even need to lose its functionality because on both console and PC, you can use your peripheral's RGB lighting to serve the same function. My Razer wireless mouse and charging dock, without setting anything up or enabling anything, would just let me know my current health without ever needing anything to be on screen. Something I'd love to see more horror games mimic. Oh, and big shout out to the most popular tweet that I've ever made in my entire life, not being about video game analysis or graphics tech, but instead RGB lights. I'm not saying I'm mad or anything, but you know, it's a little discouraging. Getting back on track though, if there is something you think you might want to do with this game's playability, there's probably some sort of option for it here, and that's not even delving into the wild amount of accessibility tweaks that could be made. As you might have noticed, I don't exactly play a lot of modern video games, but I can say this is the most amount of visual and functional customization I've ever seen in a game before, which is definitely worth praising.
Thank you.
In terms of gameplay, I think Silent Hill 2 is probably your best case scenario for a modern remake. Things have definitely been changed, and sometimes those changes are made in a direction that makes it very clear that the least common denominator was in mind. But you know, when you're recreating an experience that so many people in the mainstream have incorrectly come to see as out of date, I think this is probably the best way to go about doing that. Everything that was altered here feels like it was being done either in the spirit of the original or just generally trying to improve it. And yeah, I'm aware that that's like my 10th controversial take so far, but I feel like objectively speaking, if we put down the pitchforks and look at things without our SH fandom glasses on, there are most definitely ways that those original Silent Hill titles could have been improved on. Now, I'm not talking about wild, sweeping alterations here, but look at it this way. Did you complain about the addition of self-defense items or Crimson Heads in RE1's remake, or how about the backtracking added to Dead Space's remake? I mean, call me crazy, but I think it's possible to improve on a classic in a quality of life kind of sense, especially one that's approaching its 23rd birthday. Now, I most definitely have my complaints, but without a single doubt in my mind, this game does the original justice. It's certainly not the same experience you would get from that 2001 PS2 release, and a part of me is always going to prefer that original style of gameplay, but what's on offer here is just flat out fun. More important than that, though, it's really fun in a kind of way that only survival horror games can be. It's the only genre where walking down the same corridor 7 or 8 times in a row can be seen as a good thing, where a constant oppressive feeling of dread will either have you ready to jump out of your chair at the slightest movement in the environment or ready to question your own existence. Now, without a doubt, Silent Hill 2 is not a perfect video game. Its camera can make combat with more than one foe vomit-inducing for some, and its newfound jump from short story to novel might have come with a few pacing issues. But I would also argue that there are more than a few nitpicks you could find with the original. Now, because I don't have the same emotional connection with that first iteration of Silent Hill 2 that a lot of other people seem to have, it is possible I'm more likely to accept these changes that have been made here, but I will say this. On average, those changes have been made in a competent way that tells me Bloober team knows how to make a fun video game. I'm not exactly sure why this is a lesson they've only recently learned, but I think Silent Hill 2 Remake is a solid, worthwhile experience if you're ready to divorce yourself from a bit of your attachment to the game that spawned it. And listen, if that's something you're not willing to do, I get it. It took me a very, very long time to get right with the same exact situation regarding Resident Evil 2. But for those of you that are, I think a very engaging, modern survival horror title is waiting for you. Right here in your special place. Alright, I swear, last Silent Hill joke.
Okay, Angela. It's okay.
I want to start this off by saying the Silent Hill 2 Remake is an amazingly impressive video game in terms of visuals. There are certain aspects of its presentation that I consider to be some of the absolute best real-time 3D graphics I've ever seen. And I wish that I could tell you that's where I'm going to stop on this section, but in all honesty, there's a lot working against the game as well. For every single positive comment I'm about to make, I've got like 2 or 3 complaints in my pocket. So up front, I want to make sure you guys know exactly how amazed I am with some parts of this game's picture, because this might get a little ugly. And I think in the spirit of starting off on a good note, the town of Silent Hill has flat out never looked so realistic. The place just jumps off of your screen. Now, this might not be a commonly shared experience, but from my time touring with a death metal band, I got to see a lot of towns that you could tell used to be highly successful, but at some point it collapsed into poverty. And I can say with confidence, this is exactly what I saw driving through creepy-ass failed New England resort spots. Stepping inside one of the open shops, you can almost smell the damp carpet and the aged wooden floors creaking under your feet. And the amount of junk piled up in the alleyways and yards does an amazing job of selling the location as a real place that really was not doing very well. In keeping up with the positivity, I think this game's rendition of Silent Hill's Otherworld is mind-bogglingly cool looking. I think we finally reached a place in terms of hardware and graphical capabilities where I can actually say Silent Hill 3 on the PS2 has finally been surpassed. And you know, I'm only 20% joking about that. Now, unexpectedly, the fog shows signs of lots and lots of attention, and it looks stunning for it. In a very realistic way, the fog here makes visibility worse the further you are from an object, but the closer you get, it has a tendency of fading away like it was never there in the first place. It also moves in a really convincing way, just sort of flowing through the air like a dense liquid, obscuring small details and diffusing the light that's able to pierce it. But by far, the real MVP in this game, hands down, and this is going to be hard to explain, is the darkness. Now, I know that sounds like an easy concept to represent visually in a video game, but there's more to it than just turning the brightness down in some areas. Video game darkness, in a lot of ways, actually performs like light. It needs the proper amount of cascade to its borders, and it can be really hard to show how light dissipates and almost seems to be enveloped by it. And for nearly the entire time I was playing SH2, I was just fixated on how realistic its darkness is. The way the cone of your flashlight just disintegrates into the void and how it shows off the little particulates of dust flowing through it. Now, on the unlucky side of things, flat colors with really detailed gradients tend to show the worst side effects of YouTube's less than ideal video compression, so even if you're watching this in 4K, there's a chance you're not really seeing how great it is, but here's hoping you're getting at least a good idea. If you do have the opportunity to, I'd say viewing this game on an OLED screen is definitely the way to go. Its pixel level dimming is able to perfectly represent the game's black levels, and based on my tinkering, a gamma level of around 1.25 is going to bring out its best qualities while still allowing you to comfortably see stuff that isn't too far away. Speaking of which, I will say that the game can be annoyingly dark before you get your hands on a flashlight, making interior areas without a lot of light bleed from windows almost completely impossible to see in. Now, I know what you're thinking, just turn up the gamma that you turned down before, but doing that just makes the darkness more gray and washed out looking. It seems to me like Bloober team had a really good idea of the levels people should be viewing this game at, but did so with the flashlight in mind. And since you now spend a not insignificant amount of SH2's runtime not having one, it can be a bit of a hurdle. That aside, this is an effect that stays impressive throughout the entire game, but once you get to the historical society and more importantly the prison underneath it, the darkness really comes into its own. This area makes it really difficult to see much further than your hand in front of your face, and with the mannequins crawling around on the walls and ceiling, it makes for one hell of a tense bit of game to play through. And I think Bloober team knew this was the case, because all of the lights here only function for a certain amount of time before they turn back off again, forcing you to walk blindly through one of the creepiest locations in the entire game. And unfortunately, much like a nuclear reactor installed by the Russian government, this is where we start getting super critical. Throughout the entire game, I noticed what I would call fairly inconsistent facial animations. Now, James almost always looks great, and he's able to show a lot of nuance in the way his face can support the vocal performance going along with it. But there are times when the rest of the cast can look not so great. For example, the scene where Maria meets back up with James in Brookhaven seems off to me. I mean, she's screaming and her voice is portraying a lot of extreme emotion, but her eyes and mouth almost looks like she's speaking calmly, or at least she's not straining as hard as her voice seems to be.
Anyway, I'm glad you're alive.
Anyway? What do you mean, anyway? I was almost killed back there.
You know, if I'm being honest, the animations in the original SH2 seem to be doing a much better job. Which is pretty frustrating because there are plenty of scenes where her face animates really believably. Like this part of the game where you find her behind the bars. Her face looks great in the way that it moves and it matches her tone of voice perfectly. And the same goes for Angela. Anytime she's raising her eyebrows and looking like an apologetic kicked dog, her face animates really well. But in the big mirror room, she shifts into like 10 conflicting emotions at once. Now, to be fair, I'm not actually sure if this is a perfect one-to-one capture of the voice actor performing this scene or a lack of talent on Bloober team's end, but either way, somebody messed up. Because in a game where this level of animation is possible, this just does not work. But in contrast, if we fast forward to the new Angela cutscene added to the remake, we find that the amount of subtle movements in her eyes and mouth are flat out amazing. It kind of seems to me like each character was made with a very specific performance in mind, but anything outside of that just doesn't work very well. Like I said before, Angela always looks convincing when she's got that scared puppy dog look on her face, and anytime Maria's being seductive, she nails it. But when either of them are showing more extreme emotions, it's almost like there's an upper limit to how much they can do. For the most part, Eddie seems to have escaped this problem. He's able to portray both his more pathetic and angry sides really well, and Laura's performances all look great too. And because I don't want to invest too much time in dumb social media controversies, but I also don't want to answer a million comments about one, I'll quickly touch on the whole Angela Gate thing. Alright, let's get this over with. yes, her facial modeling does seem a bit off to me, and that's not some sort of criticism of her subjective attractiveness, but more a critique of the developer's face scan work. As far as I can tell, the model that provided Angela's likeness doesn't have a jawline and face structure that I'd sooner associate with a 40-year-old 300-pound linebacker. But before I confirm anybody's dumb culture war nonsense, I also don't think this was some sort of a purposeful attempt at nerfing her good looks. I mean, based on what I've seen with the varying levels of quality and facial animations, I'd be way more likely to assume that this was more of an example of a lack of experience in the process. I think maybe the massive jaw that they gave her would look a little more proportional if she wasn't wearing a turtleneck sweater and you were able to see the natural taper of her neck like in the original, but I really doubt Bloober Team is trying to push some kind of social politics in this scenario. Or at the very least, I haven't seen enough evidence to point me in that direction. Honestly guys, a lot of you made using Twitter during the release of this game more of a nightmare than it normally is. On one side, you had these guys claiming that the woke mind virus had infected another video game, which again doesn't seem to be the case here. And then on the other side, you had equally insane people acting like they didn't know the difference between something that's artistically or visually attractive versus sexually attractive. I swear to God, I hate this whole "you're not supposed to find Angela attractive because she's a survivor of SA" thing. Ah yes, the famously ugly Angela from Silent Hill 2. It seems like everybody's just inventing bullshit arguments to own the other side, and none of them make any sense when examined with even the smallest amount of skepticism. Now, if we're going to be genuine to everybody involved here, there have absolutely been clear-cut examples of modern video game developers outright stating that they have purposely made female characters less traditionally attractive in what I would call an attempt at pleasing a very small but disproportionately vocal and radical sector of their audience. And at the same time, reactionary types will often respond to this phenomenon in a way that makes them look like fucking lunatics who only value their next goon session. Look, the point is that you can line up on either side of this issue and still have a calm, rational conversation with someone who disagrees without being disingenuous or an idiot. Please give it a try.
In your dreams, fart face.
Moving on with the complaints, I was really thrown off by SH2's cutscenes all playing out at 30 frames per second, regardless of your selected frame rate. I mean, I guess it's understandable on console, but here on PC it can be really jarring running the game upwards of 90 frames per second and then seeing that whole process come to a stuttering halt every time it lowers down to 30. It would be one thing if these were all CG pre-renders, but you can tell by the shading artifacts this is all running in-engine, which means it doesn't have to run this way. On that same subject, but a little less baffling, is the fact that environmental animations play out at 30 FPS as well. To be fair, these are smaller details you probably aren't going to be spending too much time looking at anyways, and I assume this was a good way to squeeze more performance out of the hardware without totally messing with the realistic nature of the presentation. There's also a pretty consistent issue with trash and leaves blowing around in the wind, leaving motion trails behind them. At first I assumed this might be due to DLSS, as this can often be a side effect of enabling it, but I really couldn't find a setting that got rid of it. At this point, my only theory is that it has something to do with how things interact with the game's lumen, reflections, and lighting, but even when RTX is turned on, this is still a problem, so I guess consider me stumped. Now, getting into the more intrusive problems with SH2, I have to say that I am perpetually disappointed with this trend of developing games that can't technically be played at the resolution of most people's TVs. Silent Hill 2, like most AAA games released in the last 4 years, just cannot be run at 4K 60. Now for reference, I'm playing the game on an RTX 4090 backed up by a Ryzen 7900X and 64 gigs of lightning-fast DDR4. And don't even get me started on the ray tracing. Now, does RTX produce reflections that are orders of magnitude better looking than UE5's Lumen technology? Without a doubt. But is it also worth cutting your performance in more than half even when reflections aren't on screen? Absolutely not. Even when using DLSS, ray tracing in this game brings the best GPU on the market right now to its knees. And to be completely honest, even when you are in an area with lots of reflections, it's not going to make so much of a difference. In most scenes in the game, outside of the very beginning of this interaction with Angela in the mirror room, you're going to be sacrificing a majority of your performance for gains that you might be able to actually notice, but isn't worth the penalty you're going to be paying. It really sucks that I'm forced to enable dynamic resolution scaling just to run modern games at a playable frame rate, and it drives me insane that these things are now being developed and optimized for technology that flat out cannot be reasonably used on hardware that you can buy right now. And maybe this will make a recent game look really, really good on hardware developed 10 years in the future, but I don't know, that's not doing me a whole lot of good right now. And this next complaint isn't so much of SH2's fault, but more Unreal Engine 5. If you played Dead Space or Callisto Protocol, you're going to know that UE5's Achilles heel is its stuttery performance. Now, because these recordings have all been squeezed down to 60 frames per second, the visual hitches are going to be harder to see, but if you take a look at the frame time graph in the upper left, you'll be able to see every time the game hitches up and stutters. And just like the previous examples of Dead Space and Callisto Protocol, you can probably chalk this up to assets loading in and out of memory, because it can be reliably reproduced in central areas where your moving forward would conceivably have several potential environments loading in at once. And similarly, you can feel performance take a noticeable dive in interior rooms with open windows that'll let you see the town outside. Even when I did find settings that let me run the game well above 60 FPS, even in the most demanding situations, the choppy frame time delivery made the game feel far less smooth than I think it should have. And it sucks I need to say this, but in discussing issues like this, I've received so many comments to the tune of, well, it must be something wrong with your computer because mine runs the game fine, which can be enraging because it's something that provably is happening on an engine level and isn't limited to certain hardware configurations. Not only is this also happening to you, but according to Digital Foundry's research, it also exists on console. So no matter who you are, even if you didn't personally notice it, your game also stutters a lot. And of course, just as I start wrapping this video up, Bloober team releases a patch that's supposed to cut down on the stuttering. And based on my very limited experience with a post-hotfix game, it does seem to not creep up as much. Now, I'll be honest, I do not feel like busting out my tools and providing graphs or any kind of frame time analysis to prove this, but I would say it's definitely worth mentioning. Even taking into consideration some of the improvements made in the patch, to some degree, frame time stutter is just a reality in this game, and there's not much you can do to get rid of it aside from playing at 30 FPS where it's not as easy to feel. But since we just so happen to have stumbled on the subject, let's talk about Silent Hill 2's performance over on PS5.
Hello?
My guy Benny Gurkman from the YouTube channel Circle Cross Squared recently spent some time here in Tokyo, and after we got to go to TGS together, he was nice enough to let me spend some time with his copy of SH2 on PS5, and what I found was pretty damn interesting. At the moment, the console port of the game has two video modes, a 30 FPS quality preset and a 60 FPS performance mode. Sadly, neither is going to get you a 4K image though, as both use dynamic resolution scaling. As you might have expected, choosing performance mode is going to leave you with a much larger variance between the lowest and highest resolutions it can hit, but I was really interested to see that there wasn't a huge difference in shadows, texture, or general picture quality between the two in most of the situations that I saw. Even with a lower resolution floor, performance mode almost always looks about as sharp and detail-rich as quality, which is really nice to see. What isn't, though, is the fact that performance mode's 60 FPS target is one that it very rarely actually hits. I was able to notice really hard dips that ended up moving dangerously close to the high 30 FPS range in the starting section of the game. I will say that things did seem to smooth out as I got inside and the fog was out of the picture, but regardless of the location, this mode is anything but stable. Now technically there is a difference in lighting between the two, but I'd say you're not really missing out on much by going with performance. Choosing quality mode is going to show a little more light bounce and indirect illumination, but to be honest, the gap between the two borders on not worth mentioning territory. Here in this example, you might be able to see just a bit more red light from the save point casting across James and the roof of the well covering, but if you ask me, the darker shadows created by performance mode are actually a little more visually attractive. On the subject of reflections though, there's a pretty noticeable difference between the two. Not only does performance mode result in much lower resolution reflections, but also some kind of jittery artifacting that was so severe I originally mistook it for rain falling on these puddles. It's definitely nasty looking, and since so much of the outside sections take place on wet concrete, the issue can seem pretty strong for a large portion of the game. Taking that and the massive dips in frame rate into account, personally, I go with quality mode for a playthrough, as you'll get the benefit of a frame rate that doesn't fluctuate very much and the better reflections that don't crawl when you look at them. Besides, both of these modes use temporal upscaling to reach 4K, and the cutscenes and environmental animations play out at 30 FPS anyways, so it's kind of a more cohesive visual profile if you care about that.
Come on, don't give me that look. I was just kidding.
I think it's worth reiterating that Silent Hill 2 is absolutely stunning visually. I mean, I've never seen a game handle fog and dark environments so masterfully, and there's a lot to be said for how authentically it sticks to SH2's original design. That being said, it does suffer from a few flaws that are significant enough that I can't necessarily hand-wave them away. But if I'm being honest, a lot of them aren't unique to this game specifically. Sure, some less than stellar animations are fully within the grasp of Bloober team, but I don't think those guys are going to be fixing any serious issues with Unreal 5 in the process of making their video game. I've talked about this in other videos before, but when I go in so deep on a game's presentation issues, it's not so much me shitting on it, but more me being very interested in these things and trying to figure out what might be causing them. And you know, with Silent Hill 2, I had a lot to pay attention to. Now, admittedly, I did spend more time on the negatives than the positives, but personally, I find it's a lot easier to point at an objective problem and try to figure out what might be behind it than to show you some footage and say, use your eyes, you can tell it looks really good. At the end of the day, though, my overall takeaway is that this is an incredible looking video game. So hopefully I haven't scared anyone away by hyper-focusing on a bunch of downsides that most people probably won't care about anyways.
You should see your face, James. I was just joking.
Alright, so here comes the million-dollar question. Does this remake of Silent Hill 2 replace the original or make it obsolete? And I think you guys know the answer is already going to be a firm no. But that's not exactly a strike against it. I mean, I am supremely impressed by how good it turned out and how true it stayed to the source material. Something that's not exactly a given in the realm of video game remakes. But at the end of the day, it is a very different beast than what we all played on the PS2 in the early 2000s. It just provides a very different experience, and I think if you've stuck around this channel for a while, you're probably the kind of person who's always going to enjoy a classic survival horror game. That being said, it's really great to be able to watch the more modern iteration, or maybe I should say evolution of this genre, moving in the right direction. All of the changes made here seem to come less from a place of how can we fix this bad video game, aka the Tom Hewlett school of thought, and more from a position of how can we, with as little adjustment as possible, make such an old system work with a modern audience. I've probably said this a million times by now, but I would most definitely prefer for the titles that I loved from the early days of disc-based gaming to stay the way that I remember them. But if we are going to move away from that, I like that so many developers are making sure that their end product is going to feel spiritually respectful of its origins. As a standalone experience, I would say Silent Hill 2 is one of the more robust and engaging horror releases I've played in years. It certainly gets a little long in the tooth once you've got a good 2/3 of the way through it, but to be fair, I did have that same issue with the original. I guess the real point here is that this is a very high quality, polished video game, whether or not you're using the original as a point for comparison. I mean, I love backtracking, I love an oppressive atmosphere, and I can't get enough of that crushing existential dread, all of which can be found in abundance here. That being said, I can fully understand some of you not being able to accept a different interpretation of something that holds a lot of emotional value for you. Believe me, I've been in that exact position before and I know what it's like. But because I never really had that kind of connection with the original SH2, I'm lucky enough to be able to put a lot of my biases aside and really give this remake a shot. And if you're able to, I think a lot of you would really benefit from at least trying to do that as well. You know, I'm actually kind of hyped on where things are headed at the moment. Not only are we getting new horror games that are inspired by the classics I love so much, but all things considered, the remakes of those classics are coming out a lot more accurate than I would have originally expected, given the absolute state of everything else in the modern gaming industry. I mean, listen, I get it. A 100% faithful, one-to-one recreation of Silent Hill 2 would have been ideal. But at the moment, I don't think any board of stockholders is going to okay a sizable investment in that kind of a project. But given how well these remakes are doing both financially and critically, maybe one day that won't be true. But until then, I think I'm going to head back to doing exactly what I love. Playing through and covering classic, obscure, stupid horror games. Here's hoping we get a chance to see each other again, but until then, I'd like to thank you all very much for watching the Silent Hill Retrospective. Well, alright guys, welcome to the end of yet another very late video. I'd like to thank Mono Memory for providing an awesome SH2 remix from their Silent Hill album. I'm gonna have a link in the description to it, and I very much suggest you check it out. It's basically all I listened to while writing this script. And as you know, I also have links to my support platforms there as well. Please feel free to give me about 40 to 75% of your average monthly income. And yeah, I think that's about it, so thanks again for watching, and let's do this again sometime.